Welcome to Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books with Zibby. I'm the host, Zibby Owens. I am an author. My latest is Blank, pub date March 1st, a novel. I'm also a podcaster, obviously, a publisher, a bookstore owner, and so much more. If you love books, you're in the right place. In fact, we call it the Zibbyverse, or really, the LA Times called it the Zibbyverse, and we're going with it. Go to zibbyowens.com to learn more and follow me on Instagram at zibbyowens. Rachel Kapelke-Dale is the author of The Fortune Seller, a novel. This episode was guest hosted by Alisha Fernandez Miranda, author of My What If Year, which is a Zibby Books title. Rachel Kapelke-Dale is the author of The Ingenue and The Ballerinas, and co-author of Graduates in Wonderland. She received a BA from Brown University, where she rode on the varsity equestrian team, an MA from the Université de Paris Diderot, and a PhD from University College London. How did you like that accent, right? Pretty good? She currently lives in Paris.
Rachel, welcome to Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Happy New Year. We're still in early 2024 here. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me on. It's great to meet you and to talk with you and to be back on the pod.
Well, I am extremely excited because this weekend I dove into your book, which I had the good fortune to read early, probably the best thing about this job. And it was such a page turner. Like I could not stop. And I have a very bad habit of reading the ends of books before I finish them. It's horrible. My New Year's resolution should probably be to change it, but I think it's impossible. But of course, I had to keep I was like, wait, I don't understand. I have to go back. I have to finish. So yeah, it had me hooked. So congratulations.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really glad to hear that and delighted that it kept the tension going for you.
Yeah, good job on that. So why don't we start with just telling listeners who aren't as lucky as I have been what The Fortune Seller is about?
Absolutely. So The Fortune Seller is a book about Ivy League equestrian team in the mid-aughts, which feels so weird to say still, and young tarot card reader who kind of infiltrates the team and brings a lot of tensions to the forefront. And kind of the fallout from there, figuring out who she is and why she's there and what it means to the other girls on the team.
So I know this is your third novel, and I also know you were already it was in the works when you were on Zibby's podcast last for your previous book. What was the inspiration for this? And, what's kind of some of the backstory about how you decided to come to this story of these girls and their drama?
Well, there's so much about this book that I'd always wanted to write about. I rode horses myself when I was younger. I always thought that was a fascinating arena, not just to write about the animals, which I love, but to write about the class tensions within that world, because it is such a strange world. And the book gets into this where you have people who can be in it who aren't born from money usually because riding's so expensive, who can be in that world only if they put actual labor into it, working as grooms, working as instructors, things like that. And then the very wealthy. So it's a really interesting kind of point of class meetings. And so I always wanted to use that for a book. The title was actually something that came along before almost anything else in this book. And it came from one of my favorite books as a kid, which was the Emily of New Moon series, the Lucy Maud Montgomery series. The heroine Emily, works for so long to be a writer. She's a kid with literary ambitions, as many kind of Victorian heroines are. And eventually, I think one of her first big successes is when she gets a title from an old piece she finds in a newspaper called something like The Seller of Dreams, something very Victorian like that. Mm-hmm. And that kind of stayed with me and morphed in my mind into The Fortune Seller. Although when I went back and reread the book, it was totally different. I thought, I like the title. What would I do with that? Again, the equestrian world had always been something that appealed to me as a place to set a novel for precisely those class tensions. And I thought, that could be interesting. And from there, I I set out almost with like a Mad Libs of things that I want to write about. I'd wanted to write about tarot. I'd wanted to write, a little bit about astrology, wanted to write about what it's like to be in New York right after graduation, without any money in particular. So these things came together in various ways. Wanted to write a dog in there. I love putting a dog in my books. And then kind of whittling and seeing thematically what works. And, I'm not sure I think so much about theme while I'm drafting, but in revisions, of course, that starts to come through. So my first drafts do tend to be kind of a hodgepodge of just things I like.
Are you a pantser or a plotter? So did you already know kind of what was going to happen? Because the story it really unfolds, and it's one of those great stories that when you go back after you know what's happened, in my case, midway through the book, or in other people's case, when they actually finish, you see all of these beautiful kind of Easter eggs and little clues that were dropped throughout. So is that how you write? Do you write based on an outline, or are you more of like, let's see where this goes?
So for a long time, I really was a pantser, but I ended up with a lot of novels, a lot of manuscripts that were just people sitting around and talking. I have ADHD. I think I've mentioned that before. My brain will let me go 800 pages into a conversation I find interesting and nobody else cares about it. And so I really, but that's also where some of the gold is. So I like to kind of have a few months to a year before I start writing, actually writing on the page, where I'm just kind of wool gathering and jotting things down. And the stakes don't feel as high as if I thought of it as like actual drafts.
Right.
But when I write in my notes app, little moments or sentences or ideas for scenes, that's my wool gathering process.
Mm-hmm.
And then I arrange it into an outline. I have these absurdly complicated Excel spreadsheets.
I
love to waste time needlessly organizing things that don't need to be that carefully organized. But that really helps me too with revisions, because I can see what scenes are necessary to the structure of the book. I can see what scenes are no longer necessary. They may have been early on, but, at a certain point fall away. I can see, the scenes that were in earlier drafts and things like that without having to go generalize from a manuscript. So yeah, I do end up plotting pretty carefully in the end, but I don't come to a novel with a predetermined plot. When I do that, the characters come out they come out very forced. It has to, you have to kind of listen to the characters as you write and adapt from there, because it's all about what they do in any given situation. And if the situation isn't right or what they would do isn't right, then, particularly with, this novel where you have four girls, or a novel like this, four girls from what I think are pretty similar backgrounds, ranging from middle class to super upper class.
Yeah.
But I mean, they're four young women of the same generation, all relatively comfortable, plus on up, of the same race, of the same education. I think, the fear that I have going into that is that I don't have them differentiated enough to get their voices distinct, and their voices really come from, come out of the actions that they take. And as I kind of figure out the kind of people that they are. So as that develops over drafts, sometimes scenes no longer make sense and they gotta go.
Are you good at doing that? Are you good at killing your darlings?
I am. And the only reason for that, again, is just I know how my brain works. And if there's something, and I know that I will write, I will write a 50-page description of a horse or a dog that nobody cares about, and I'm like, well, I'm glad I know that dog. Okay, let's take that out of the book and, move on.
Put it on the wall. We'll write, it'll be ode to the dog. Exactly.
I have a lot of documents on my computer that are just those darlings for another time, for another draft, for a different project.
Yeah, that's very good. So, I mean, you mentioned this a little bit, but this book is about this horse community where you have a number of different people coming from different parts of life and different socioeconomic strata that can come together. But it also takes place in the Ivy League, in this very upper echelons, very kind of locked off place of society. And you're talking about class and privilege and how they intersect there and how difficult it can be to break in. So, I mentioned I was in my childhood home with my parents. You are also at your parents' house right now. So I was reading your book over the weekend, and then we were playing a lot of board games, right? So we're playing the game of life with my children, which I don't know if you've played that game ever or like in the last however many years, but you start, the way the game works now is that you get a salary card at the beginning. And if you start with a small salary, your chances of digging yourself out of that financial hole by the end of the game are like almost impossible, which is kind of similar to life. And I pulled out this quote that Rosie says earlier in the book. So early in the book, Rosie is the main character. She says, the idea that all of life was open to you, not just a little sliver of it, that all you had to do was go around pointing at things, experiences, people, saying mine, mine, mine. The ability to choose, that was my idea of heaven. And so I was thinking about all of these things as I'm playing the game of life and losing miserably against my children, my extremely competitive son who's like hiding his money under the bed so no one can see how much he has. But I went to Harvard for my undergrad. I graduated in 2004. A lot of these experiences are very relatable for me, believable. I met people like Cress, another main character in the book. And I saw that you also went to an Ivy, you went to Brown. So did you know people like this when you came into this world? Is that part of the book also based on experiences that you had kind of coming into the Ivy League from wherever you were coming from?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I should say that nothing in the book actually happened to me. It's
Let's hope.
the vibes, the vibes did, but nothing. None of the murders or anything. But, yeah, I grew up with my parents are both professors in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and when I was leaving for Brown, I'll never forget. My father said to me, you're going to encounter people from backgrounds that you've never encountered before, at Brown. And I thought, oh my God, what kind of great Gatsby talk is this? This is so ridiculous. But then you get there and it had been, expected that I would, and again, like I was very comfortable as a child. Like my background was fairly comfortable, middle class. And, but it was expected that I would work a job for spending money, and that, when I graduated, so I graduated 2007. So I wasn't covered under my parents' health insurance.
Mm-hmm.
So my mom was like, you're getting a job because health insurance is what, $1,000 a month. And, that's just what you do. But at the same time, a lot of the people that I knew, were on this spectrum that was even more privileged than the background that I had come from, where, they were going, oh, well, my parents say my job is to be a student. I'm going, well, that must be nice. Or buying $100 bottles of wine at dinner and this kind of thing. And it's, it's delightful to be around, of course, but it really was different from anything that I'd ever experienced, and then at the same time, there were kids in my class who were coming out with huge financial aid packages, student loans, things, just this place where I think, especially growing up in kind of 90s middle class middle America, especially, I had thought, we live in a meritocracy, and it's, I really, really believed that to the point where I hadn't questioned it. And then all of a sudden, you're surrounded by these levels of wealth, that other 18-year-olds have access to. You're going, wait a minute, none of us has done anything to deserve any of this.
Yeah.
Whether it's being, born with the privilege to get there, or the intelligence to get there, or the combination, or the work ethic to get there. But again, see, even now I'm going, oh, the work ethic to get there, as though just work ethic can get you to an Ivy, whereas really it's systems. So I think the Ivies have always interested me as institutions, as this kind of byword for privilege, but also this byword for, oh, you can get there if you work really hard. And it takes that, certainly, but in most cases, if you're not Cressida Tate from the book. But it also takes a lot of luck. And I think that's the kind of X factor. And I think you must get this with Harvard. I mean, especially because, I live in France. I went to Brown, but people kind of know what it is, but they don't really. Whereas Harvard all over the world, is kind of owning it after graduation is a strange thing. Because after graduation, I was in New York and people go, "Oh, you went to Brown. Well, why are you doing this job?" You're like, because it's a job, because it's work. The health insurance, but you go, "Oh, well," I just remember being really uncomfortable with people's judgments of that, and going, "Oh, well, you must be so smart." And you're going, "Well, no, it's luck, and and just this which is probably a very middle class trait too. Again, the Cressida Tate in the book is not somebody who's going, "Oh, I went to Yale, but I'm not that smart."
It's so funny. I'm sure she's not. My son, who's 12, will sometimes like he now knows what Harvard is because he sees it on TV and in shows and stuff like that. And he's like, just say to me all the time, like, "Mom, I can't believe you were smart enough to go to Harvard." I'm like, first of all, ouch. Second of all, yes, I was. But third of all, you do need to understand. And I think one of the great benefits actually of my experience there was being able to see a lot of the underlying machinations in the system of how that world works in a way that you never could have explained to me before I got there, because you start to see, you see how inherited privilege and generational privilege, how it manifests itself among your peers and among friends. And there are lots of ways to take advantage of that. My thing was always like with boys, like you never wanted to tell boys after college that you went to Harvard because you didn't want them to think you were too smart. So like, I went to college in Boston. It took me a little while to own that properly. But now I'm so far out. Nobody cares where I went to college anymore. It's like I'm very far away and I'm very ancient. So you mentioned you live in Paris. What brought you there? Tell me about your fabulous expat life where you wear stripes and eat baguettes and wear those frou-frou outfits like Emily in Paris. I bet, are you just walking around in super high heels all day long? Tell me.
I have not worn heels since the pandemic, I should
love
say.
It. I love that for you. I love it.
But yeah, so I studied abroad in Paris, and then I did my master's there because I realized when I was studying abroad that, well, our parents and our, student loans were paying 40 grand a year, or whatever it was at the time. The French students who were being exchanged were paying about 300 in tuition, which included health insurance.
Ooh.
So as soon as I had the chance after college, I worked in New York for a while. Then I decided to go do my master's in France for, again, $300 a year, health insurance included. And then I got kind of caught up in that system and in the academia of it all again. I ended up doing my PhD. I did that in London because my written French isn't strong enough to do, a doctorate in. And after that, I published my first book with Just Pan during my doctorate and realized that was the area I wanted my life to go, but I couldn't give up the doctorate. I had to finish it, it already is a sunk cost fallacy. Yeah. So I finished the doctorate in cinema studies, and but then I thought, well, if I'm just going to write, I could be living anywhere. And I love London, but in terms of quality of life, in terms of what feels like my city, Paris was where I wanted to be. So I still had a lot of friends there. Moved back to France. It's been since 2018 is when I moved back. So it's been wonderful. It is a great country to live in. I mean, there are the glamorous aspects. It's very funny. I was teaching a writing class this semester and of exchange students from the United States, and a lot of them in their early essays were writing about Emily in Paris and kind of their experiential essays. And I was like, okay, just wait, see what you think, because the rats on the subway are not necessarily featured in that show.
Yeah, cut scenes. Those are cut scenes.
Yeah, exactly. Bloopers. But no, it's a wonderful place to live, to work, to write, of course.
I love it. It's on my list. So I'm in Scotland now, and I have been an expat. Similar experience, studied abroad in the UK, went back for my master's, moved back to live in 2008. And something that's been interesting for me is writing about America and Americans and in my American voice that exists in my head, but from abroad. I mean, have you had that experience kind of writing? Your book is very much set in the New Haven in New York, 2005, 2006. Do you think that you have a different perspective of that sitting in Paris working on this versus if you were living full time in the US?
It's really hard to it's hard to say, it's hard to imagine, alternate world, alternate universe Rachel, but probably it's tricky because of course I've also gotten older and we've all lived through, the late 2010s. We've all lived through a pandemic since then. So, when I was writing this and trying to get back into the mindset of college, that I had in college, which I loved college, despite everything I've said here. It was really a wonderful time. It was incredible experiences. It's afterwards that, again, the structures that allowed me to be there, that allowed my friends to be there, that allowed the people I knew to be there, kind of became a lot more evident. So I really think it's time more than distance. But in some ways, also, I mean, living in a country with a fairly progressive government, Macron is not progressive in the European sense, but for Americans,
yes.
Basically Bernie Sanders.
Exactly. He's off the charts.
Has, especially in contrast with kind of American government of, a few years ago, got to see very different like pandemic responses, very different kind of structural things that really ended up affecting like my daily life, certainly in the daily life of, I think, a lot of people in France. So, so there is something to be said of, for that kind of simultaneous alternate universe.
Yeah.
where you do get that distance. But in terms of the distance, I don't know. I think there certainly is something to be said for, for living under different institutions and trying to understand the way that they function.
Well, yeah, it gives you a different perspective, doesn't it? You kind of see the assumptions of that things are all like this everywhere. And then you go somewhere else and you're like, oh, maybe things can be different somewhere else. And what are the reasons why things are the way they are? I think it's really fascinating. And even the culture at those like top tier universities in France, in the UK, and in the US, they're very different. They're very, very different in positive and negative ways. So,
and in France, the tuition is so much lower, as I've said, that, and there aren't these X factors in admission like extracurriculars and, things that like, if you're working a job in high school, it can be so much more difficult because you're not also a theater star or, a Rory Gilmore, newspaper reporter, like deep dive there. But
that's those separate podcasts we'll need to record, Rachel. If you're a Gilmore Girls fan, we could go down a whole rabbit hole.
Please, I'm in. But without those X factors, and they say, oh, it's completely a meritocracy, and then you talk to people who've been through this system and they go, even then, it's not really, because the more elite high schools, the more exclusive high schools feed into these systems. There are, coded ways of writing that, show your socioeconomic background and things like that. So, it's, I think as a kind of a progressive American, it's so easy for me to be like, oh, France is amazing. And France is going, we're better, but we still have problems.
Yeah. It's so fascinating. Now, tell me what you're working on now. Give us a sneak peek.
I'm working on 2 projects at the moment. First time I've done kind of a simultaneous pairing. The first is a nonfiction project about this kind of medical mystery tour I was on for the past decade and figuring out some strange symptoms in the UK, the US, and France across the 3 systems. And that can be very heavy to write. So I need to kind of dip in and out. At the same time, I'm working on a project, another one set in France, like my first novel, But this one is about the French Resistance and generational trauma, but set in, again, the early 2000s, which is apparently I just want to regress to.
Look, it was a simpler time. It was a simpler time.
Oh, it's so funny to me now. Like, yeah, my students having this like a millennial, envy. And I'm like, it was not that great, you guys. It was interesting, but we had our issues.
Yeah. I'm like, aren't you all wearing the same clothes now? Can't you see what this was all about? Those chokers were very uncomfortable.
Oh my God. I wore low-rise jeans for the first time in about 20 years. And it was like, these are terrible.
Oh my God. It makes me shudder to think about putting on a pair of low-rise jeans right now. Oh my God. Oh, Rachel, it's been so great to catch up with you. Let's finish this off with our classic question. I know you've already done this and you've already given your writerly advice. So what new writerly advice do you have for the listeners today?
Oh gosh.
It could be old. You could repeat the same thing. It's
I'm like, I don't remember what I said last time.
Just any advice. If it's the same thing you said last time, then we're just going to say it's that good that it's really bears repeating.
Well, it's going to take a really passionate listener to compare and contrast. But I know all of the mom's audience is passionate, which is great. I think the biggest thing that I would say is just to dive into reading and writing the kind of stuff that you want to read and write as much as you possibly can. Read so widely within your genre, outside of your genre, find the things that you love, try reading things that you would never think that you'd like, dip in and out of different authors, go, read everything one author's ever written, go into the acknowledgements, read everything all the authors she recommends, keep doing that and play around. I think a lot of people don't necessarily know, what they want to do in terms of genre, in terms of story, until you write a lot, you play a lot, and you throw a lot out. So that's my advice, is just to get in there as much as I can.
Yeah, I love it. Beautiful. Well, Rachel, The Fortune Seller is out now. Everybody needs to go and read it. Rachel, thank you again for being on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram at Zibby Owens and at Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Also sign up for my newsletter at zibbyowens.com and sign up for my virtual book club and meet lots of authors on Zoom every other week. Thanks so much to Steve and Ryan at Texture Sound for the sound editing. And thank you to Morning Moon Productions for providing this fantastic intro and outro music.